Today I'm going to talk about Christopher Hitchens' challenge to unbelievers. I'm going to give an independent response. I'm not representing any group or any denomination, just my own individual perspective. In Hitchens' writings, you can find two versions of the challenge. In one place he says, I challenge you to find one good or noble thing which cannot be accomplished without religion. In another place he says, name one ethical statement made or one ethical action performed by a believer that could not have been uttered or done by a non-believer. In other words, what good is religion? What good is belief? Does it really make you behave any better? That's Hitchens' challenge. All right, so let's consider version 1. Version 1 says, I challenge you to find one good or noble thing which cannot be accomplished without religion. Now let's focus on that word religion. What does he mean by religion? The Bible defines religion as follows. Pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is this, to visit widows and orphans in their affliction and to remain unspotted from the world. So this is a biblical definition of religion. Because everyone who shows compassion and maintains their integrity is practicing the Christian religion in this sense. Indeed, Christianity has no monopoly on the Christian religion, according to the biblical definition of religion. So Hitchens may be right, but only because the religion that he's talking about has nothing to do with the religion of the Bible. Indeed, Hitchens is thinking about the common conception of religion, which really has nothing to do with the religion of the Bible. Hitchens' challenge is indeed a wake-up call to Christians whose religious focus is wrongly directed, whose religion is based on ritual or doctrine or some other kind of observance. The religion that God values is written in blue right here. All right, so in other words, the first version of the challenge in some ways I agree with, but only because his definition uses common conception of religion rather than the biblical definition of religion. So let's go to version 2. Name one ethical statement made or one ethical action performed by a believer that could not have been uttered or done by a non-believer. So there's something believers can do that non-believers can't do. And so he's talking about believers. So what does he mean by belief or faith? What is meant here? Faith in the Bible denotes faithfulness. Bishop Tom Wright has talked about this, that faith is not a matter of conviction more than a matter of commitment. For instance, faithfulness is shown by a spouse who is a monogamous spouse who is entirely faithful to his spouse. That's faithfulness. Biblical faith also means dependence. Okay. Jesus says, I am the vine, you are the branches. He who abides in me and I in him, the same brings forth much fruit, but without me you can do nothing. So this denotes complete, absolute dependence upon him. We're not talking about conviction and not talking about doctrine. You're talking about a way of being that is not independent, but entirely dependent. In another place it says, those who wait on the Lord or on Jehovah or I am shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall not walk and not faint. So it's talking about waiting on the I am, on Jehovah, and receiving strength and inspiration from that waiting or dependence. Now, the Bible itself takes little stock in so-called faith in the modern sense. So in James it says, you believe there's one God, you do well. Even the demons believe and tremble. Many atrocities certainly have been committed in the name of faith. Paul speaks of zeal for God without knowledge. So faith may be mistaken for zeal in the modern terminology, but the Bible does not mistake these two. Jesus, in fact, was crucified by the most faithful believers of his day, most religious people. Their true motivations were self-will and self-aggrandizement. Their godliness was for their own gain, and Hitchens is quite right to criticize such so-called faith. Like sex, conviction can be a force for great good or great evil. Religious conviction and zeal can be a force for good or for evil, like a hammer. Okay. So Hitchens says, name one ethical statement, one ethical action that a believer can do that a non-believer can't do. Now, is this really a fair criterion? Our lives don't consist of isolated moral actions. So I could say, tell me one note on the piano that Horowitz or Rubinstein can play that I can't play also. So does that mean I'm as great a pianist as they are? That single note in isolation does not really give any indication of the greatness of the musician. In fact, Hitchens' challenge is an echo of Pharaoh's challenge to Moses. He says, why should I let you go? My magicians can do the same thing. Moses turned water to blood, so Pharaoh's magicians turned water to blood. Moses made flies come, Pharaoh's magicians made flies come, and so on. Now, this is the very same challenge that Hitchens is making to believers. What can you do that I can't do? And indeed, from this point of view, Hitchens' challenge is really rather ridiculous, just as Pharaoh's was to Moses. Now, Hitchens says, name one action that a believer can do that an unbeliever can't do. But it's not what we can do, but what we actually do. For instance, Hitchens himself was an alcoholic. This is universally recognized by everyone except perhaps Hitchens himself. Hitchens unfortunately died from alcohol-related symptoms. Okay. He could have freed himself from alcohol addiction. He could have, but he didn't. He was self-deceived. So it wasn't what he could do, it's what he actually did. In fact, Hitchens' life bears mightier witness than his pen. Okay. So, now, if we talk about actions, there's more to an action than appearance. In the book of Corinthians it says, I speak with tongues of men and of angels, but if I have not love, I'm like a banged pot or a clanging cymbal. Although I give all my possessions to feed the poor, and even deliver my body to be burned, and have not love, I gain nothing. So these external actions, although impressive, are not the whole story. Without love, eventually they're inefficacious. But if there's no visible difference, what's the difference? If I give my possessions to feed the poor, I don't have love, how can you tell the difference between that and someone who does have love? Now you know for yourself that there's something missing. If you do a charitable action for personal selfish motives, you know for yourself. And two identical actions may not have the same long-term impact. You can't just look on the short term or on the immediate effect. So let me give actually some moral actions that are peculiar to believers. A believer can be completely at peace with the world and with herself because she has peace with God. Now, was Hitchens a man at peace with himself? No, look, if you just look at the videos on YouTube, just see his demeanor, and you have to question that. It doesn't really show that kind of peace with himself or with the world. Certainly the man he's a cynic, but in some way he's a brilliant, hard shell. Shades of Voltaire and Bertrand Russell. You read biographies of Bertrand Russell and people's comments on him, how brilliantly cynical he was, and just sort of empty. His great intellect, but surface. All right, so other moral actions peculiar to believers. A believer can forgive others as Christ forgave her. Now, unbelievers can certainly forgive, but there's a depth of forgiveness represented by the forgiveness of Christ on the cross that a believer has access to. A believer can tap that well. An unbeliever cannot tap that well. In particular, a believer can forgive herself. How do you deal with regrets? Do you just pass them and move on? Do you just forget about them? A believer can face those regrets and fully can embrace those actions that they've done that they regret, and fully recall them and fully reconcile themselves to the things that they've done, the bad things that they've done, because they know that Christ has forgiven them. Okay? An unbeliever can forgive and forget, but a believer can forgive and remember. Think of Peter, who denied Christ. Now, who would want to remember that? Now, Peter, in fact, remembered that, and that was an integral part of his preaching, that the forgiveness he received through Christ was the same forgiveness that he could offer others. All right, you look in the Bible, Joseph, in the Old Testament, the things that his brothers did to him, threw him down a well, had him enslaved for years. he could look back and say, God meant it for good. How an unbeliever can really have that perspective. As I said, Peter denied Christ 3 times, and that was something that he should be ashamed of, but through the forgiveness of Christ, he actually was able to glory in that, knowing that he himself was nothing, he himself had failed Christ, but Christ does not fail. Paul was a serial murderer. And again, that was an integral part of his preaching, that the things that he had done in ignorance and zeal, God redeemed them. God turned him around. God was glorified, and not Paul in himself. Believers can see this big picture. For unbelievers, it's all random. In the case of Joseph, they would just say, Joseph had a lucky turn. Joseph says that the things that his brothers did to him were in fact part of the plan of God. An unbeliever can only say, well, you did horrible things to me, and I just happened to come out on top anyway. Right? A believer can give freely, trusting God to supply her needs. An unbeliever has to think about their own supply. Jesus says, freely have you give, freely you've received, freely give. A believer can both give and offer freedom from self-destructive addictions, alcohol, sex, and other neurotic desires. And as I mentioned, Hitchens himself is an example of someone who is not able to free himself from such addictions. This is a basic part of the gospel message. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me to proclaim liberty to the captives. And the captivity that the Bible emphasizes is captivity to sin. So an unbeliever cannot offer this freedom because they do not have resource to the Spirit of the Lord. So, in summary, what counts as individuals, not generic action. So Hitchens' challenge is focusing on the wrong thing. And there are many things that I couldn't have done without depending on God and the leading of His Spirit. And there are many things that you cannot do if you do not depend on Him or serve Him. You can't receive forgiveness. You can't be at peace with yourself and the world. You can't deal with regrets over your past actions the way a believer can. And you can't really see a purpose in the things that have happened to you that have hurt you, but God has meant for good. So, thank you for listening.